Welcome to all of you who are with us on Zoom or Facebook Live, who will hear this conversation on our podcast, Let's Find Common Ground. I'm Bob Shrum, the director of the Center for the Political Future at USC Dornsife. Our topic today is the politics of the conclave, ? We chose this title with respect for the realities of what has to be the most unique election on earth. Yes, there are politics involved, and if you're a believer, the Holy Spirit is involved as well. But the Holy Spirit does not dictate the outcome. As Pope Benedict once said, I would not say that the Holy Spirit picks the Pope, because there are too many contrary instances of popes the Holy Spirit obviously would not have picked. I would say that the Spirit does not exactly take control of the affair, but like a good educator, as it were, leaves us much space, much freedom, without entirely abandoning us. Thus, the Spirit's role should be understood in a much more elastic sense. Perhaps we could say that the politics of the conclave is in the interstices of that elasticity. Now let me introduce our panelists and welcome. Richard Wood is the president of the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies here at USC. He is an expert in religion and democracy, the author of a number of books, including A Shared Future, Faith-Based Organizing for Racial Equity and Ethical Democracy, and Faith in Action, Religion, Race, and Democratic Organizing in America. Father Tom Gibbons is the vice president of Paulist Productions and the creator of the television documentary Isaac Hecker and the Journey of Catholic America. Some of you may have seen him, many of you may have seen him over the last several weeks talking about the death of Pope Francis and what lies ahead on television. He's also the former administrator of St. Peter's Church in Toronto, Canada. And if we were going to talk about a different election, we'd talk with him about the Canadian one. So we're going to talk with each other for about 45 minutes and then turn this over to questions from the audience. Please put your questions in the chat so I can read them. So let me turn first to this. Pope Francis appointed 80% of the cardinal electors. But as history teaches us, that is no guarantee that his successor will follow in his footsteps. The Cardinal Secretary of State, one of the presumed frontrunners, has argued that this, though, is exactly the kind of pope who should be chosen. On the other hand, more traditional cardinals like Gerhard Mueller, whom Pope Francis chose not to reappoint as head of the Vatican's doctrinal body, are now rallying around what they call unity, which cardinals who share the Francis vision interpret as a coded call to roll back his reform policies, such as opening the possibility of communion to divorced and remarried Catholics and permitting the blessing of same-sex couples. They want to continue, the people who share the Pope Francis's vision want to continue his focus on social justice, inclusivity, environmental protection, and global outreach. Can you each discuss the balance of power in the conclave? And I'm not asking you to tell me who's going to win, but what side is likely to prevail here? What view is likely to prevail here? Or is it more likely we end up somewhere in the middle? Richard?
Well, great to be here with you all. I think this conclave is particularly difficult to predict or talk about that balance of power because it assumes that those particular issues that you just described, Bob, are really what's going to be driving the conclave. And I would think there's some other factors that are central as well. The church faces some very difficult financial questions. So the cardinal electors are going to be really trying to think through which candidate has most promise to help resolve some of that. The world and the church face these vast, call them geostrategic problems of the rise of authoritarianism, wars in the Middle East, in Africa, in Ukraine and Russia. All those things really matter as they're thinking about the future. And then the other piece I would say is, how are the cardinals going to split around other parts of Francis's legacy? One of the key allies of Cardinal Parolin, who, as you said, is by some considered a front runner, this week, this is a cardinal who is seen as a close ally of Francis. In one of the talks in Rome, is reported to have come out very strongly against Francis's choice to open up leadership in the Vatican to people who are not ordained. Code word probably for many women in leadership in the Vatican. How the cardinals are going to split on those questions, I think, is very unknown and makes this a much more complicated conclave than folks are giving it credit for.
Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I think, kind of going along with what Richard said, like, I think, one of the things I think I've always had to kind of caution myself on is understanding that we tend to look at these things through American eyes. So it's like our understanding of what a progressive or a conservative might be from an American context may not exactly line up with how different cardinals would do it. Like, for example, one of the contenders in Africa, Cardinal, I may be missing his, forgive me for if I mispronounce his name, but Cardinal Mbongo Basungnu from the Congo, he has been very, very strong on environmental issues, which would be something that would be very dear to progressives in America. But he would not, is definitely not open for a conversation on LGBTQ, which would, so it's that there's all these kind of a mix. And I think what's interesting about this conclave is because Francis appointed many different cardinals, but he also appointed them he brought a lot of diversity into the places around the world from which they're coming from. And these places may not have the exact same sensibilities that in terms of what the issues are that many Americans may have. It doesn't mean our issues are any less important, but it's one of those cautions where they don't line up perfectly, in that way.
So now I'm going to ask you if you can be a little more certain in answering the next question, which will go to you first, Tom.
Yeah.
Many of the public lists of so-called frontrunners include cardinals who were removed from major offices in the church by Pope Francis. The Cardinals Robert Serra, Cardinal Raymond Burke. They're on lists, they're profiled. Do you think they have a realistic chance?
My suspicion would be no. And I think the reason is it doesn't mean that the cardinals of the church may decide that we need somebody who is more traditional. But I think, one of the things about the conclave experience is that there is a desire for consensus. It's, in some ways, maybe your experience, Bob, may have a little bit of this. It's like when we're trying to pick a vice president for a party nominee, it's kind of like, all right, like, there's the fringe candidate may have like somebody that they all like, but it's like, well, this person has a couple of things and they'll be okay. And I think that's one of the things the conclave process tends to lift up, because you have to get to 2/3 votes. So I think, and I'm not necessarily calling Burke or Sarah fringe, but I definitely know they seem to have a core group of supporters, but don't really raise up beyond that. So I think it would be unlikely. I know those names are often tossed around, in terms of what would be ideal for a very narrow political sect, but I think it would be very unlikely. It's kind of like, if we're to do the U.S. election, it's kind of like, Pat Buchanan in 1988, he may have his followers, but at the end of the day, it's going to be George W. Bush who gets the nomination, or Bernie Sanders, but it becomes Hillary Clinton. So I would kind of maybe look at those, look at those names in that frame of mind.
Richard?
On this, I think I agree with Father Tom pretty strongly. I certainly think it's possible that a more conservative candidate will emerge from the conclave as our next pope, but I would be surprised if it were one of those two, just given all those factors. And I do want to note, I think it's the Vatican reporter John Allen who's spoken of history is strewn with the carcasses of those who tried to predict who the next pope was going to be. So we could be totally wrong, and it could be one of them.
Well, we're going to stay in the prediction business for a minute, and then I want to get to one other aspect of this too. The front runners, who seem to me to have a serious chance, include the Cardinal Secretary of State, who's just been mentioned, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, the former Archbishop of Manila, and now a high Vatican official, has been called the Asian Francis. and a number of others ranging from the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, who actually happens to be Italian, to several European cardinals like Cardinal Zuppi, the Archbishop of Bologna, who've been close collaborators with Pope Francis. How much stock should we put in these lists, given that, with one rare exception I can think of, none of the 2013 prognostications before that conclave cited Jorge Bergoglio as the likely choice? Richard?
You know, I think take those lists seriously as lists of potentials. I do not think the Cardinals are working from those lists. They're discerning. I think the movie Conclave gets this right. It's a combination of a kind of political process and maneuvering with some really well-intentioned cardinals literally trying to pray their way to a discernment about the best future for the church. So, those lists are nice for thinking about who it might be, but I wouldn't take them as any kind of a definitive portrayal of what's likely to happen.
Father Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. It's, my quip has been, Jorge Bergoglio was on no one's, Final Four bracket, 13 years ago. Even though reports say he came in second when Benedict the 16th was elected Pope. I think Benedict the 16th, I think Cardinal Ratzinger was, I think Richard, you would probably agree. My sense was he was highly predicted to win, and then he did. It was a very fast conclave. I think there was that desire to keep whatever John Paul II had put in place, and Ratzinger was to see that. So a part of me wonders if I'm just putting on my my betting, not betting cap, because that would be wrong, but putting on my thinking cap, I can see where there might be a candidate who would want to continue what Francis is doing, particularly around the idea of the synodal process, about how do we communicate with one another as church, and maybe not, and would want to keep that process going. And I think that's one of the strengths that Francis has brought in many ways, is that he yes, he was seen. I always like to say, I like to quote Cardinal Casper, who says Francis is not a liberal, he's a radical. And I think, and so I don't, what Francis was always open to, he was open to a diversity of opinion. He had his own opinions, no question about that. But I think he always was someone who liked to bring everyone together and have that larger discussion. And I think my prayer for that is whoever becomes Pope continues this desire to listen to where the people are at and listen to the synodal process.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. Would each of you talk about the synodal process? Because not everybody watching this will fully understand what's meant by it. And why does it arouse such opposition in some quarters in the church and in the Vatican?
Yeah. So yeah, the word synodal doesn't work very well in English.
Right.
Makes me think of sinus infections. But its deep history in the Eastern Catholic world is important. And it is part of Francis's effort to really do two things, I think. One, signal and embody a real openness to the Orthodox churches, and with the hope in the long term of reunifying the church, East and West. And secondly, laying the groundwork. Sometimes this is talked about as democracy in the church, and I think that's to really mischaracterize it. Synodality is about hearing one another, getting more people involved in the conversation, drawing on the expertise, that amazing amount of expertise that's embedded in Catholic lay people all over the world, men and women, bringing them into the church to help shape how the bishops are thinking about the future, broaden the set of ideas they can draw on. But it very much works within a very traditional understanding of episcopal authority, I think. No longer authority as unilateral exercise of power with no discussion, but a much more authoritative sense of episcopal authority as drawing on the best wisdom they can find, and then making decisions for the good of the church. I think that's the way to think about synodality, and I do think this is probably the most important dividing line in the conclave. Is the conclave going to pick someone likely to continue the synodality direction in the church? or somebody who's going to turn the church's back on what Francis has tried to do? That's the big question to me.
Well, of course, the big question going into the conclave in 63 was whether or not the new pope would continue the Vatican Council II. And there were a whole group of cardinals who wanted it just stopped, ended. We don't have to do it again. And Cardinal Montini, who had elected as Paul VI, his first announcement was the council will continue. Why, Father Tom, is there such opposition to this kind of consultation, whether it's the council or a synod? I don't understand. I'm a Catholic. I don't understand it.
Yeah, no, I think, we all have different ecclesiologies, ecclesiology meaning understanding or theology of the church. And for many people, many Catholics drive their ecclesiology from truth. A Platonic ideal of truth that the church encapsulates when Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And then I think if we think of, there are many, I think, who look at truth as this static thing that can never move and this thing that has to be defended at all costs. I think then synodality can be a little scary because then you have people, because then it's wait a minute, you're changing the truth. It's you're making that which is making something relative, which is supposed to be objective. And I think that there's kind of like a defense there, and especially in this modern world where there's just constant change all the time. There's so many people who are just looking for something to hold on to, and the church provides that in many ways. So any discussion about change or evolution, no pun intended, can be a little scary because there's so much change in the world that one of the attractions that I hear from many young people is that they love the seemingly static nature of the church. I think what Francis has tried to understand, and those of us who were, I can't say I was alive during Vatican II, but my first masses were folk masses, is that, there's kind of like saying, well, we believe in God and we believe in truth, but our way of understanding these truths evolve and they change and they grow. And that's an exciting thing. And I think there's also, I think John Paul II had so many bishops. His main concern when he was appointing bishops was doctrine. How do we kind of like put the Vatican II changes within a strict framework? Because there was a sense that everything was getting loosey-goosey. Where with Francis, when Francis was appointing bishops, he wanted pastors. He wanted people. Have you had to run a parish? Have you had to sit with a couple? He didn't want academics were okay, but he wanted people to really have, not exclusively academics, people who did not see themselves as defender of a particular faith or philosophy, but people who were willing to, as we've heard so many times, have the smell of the sheep.
I want to get back to the politics, but listening to this, I have to comment that without the first synod or council, whatever you want to call it, in Jerusalem in the first century, we wouldn't have had a very effective mission to the Gentiles from the apostles. I mean, Peter was on the wrong side initially. Right. He wanted to insist that if you were going to be a Christian, you had to obey all of the Jewish dietary laws and the other rituals. And St. Paul was the person who argued against him. So they really did have a discussion before they came to a conclusion. I just think what's happened, from my point of view, is that faced with the challenges of the modern world, the church tended to step back from that and think of itself as a citadel that had to be defended.
Right.
And I think Francis said, no, let the gates down. Let the people in. Let's hear from them.
Bob, can I comment on that?
Oh, you can comment on anything you want.
Okay. So a couple things. One, I don't want to be misunderstood as saying that, if the next pope comes on the balcony and says synodality is going to continue or not, somehow that's the key test. I don't particularly care whether that language of synodality is preserved. The important thing is that deeper commitment to building consultative processes in the life of the church. That to me is truly crucial. On this latter thing, I think both of you are exactly right. The world is such a complex place. There's so much insecurity, there's so much turbulence in the world that one response to that is to latch on to the truth of the church, the holiness of the church, and that's sort of the final spot. I think what Francis did was to say, no, that's a false promise.
Mm.
The real security is a much deeper experience of holiness, the relationship between I and a God who loves me, the God of Jesus, a much deeper spirituality that provides for a context of security, calls us beyond fear. And out of that confidence, then we can engage with that complexity and turbulence in the world.
Mm.
I think we have to be really humane, and understanding with the sense of insecurity that drives some of the latching on to things, and offer something deeper. So I'm interested in the relationship of synodality, however it's named, and liturgy and spirituality, deep sacramental experience that allows people to live into this vision of church that Francis put.
Yeah, and going along with that, I think, I know in the beginning we were joking about, oh, we need to disagree with each other in order to have like stronger, stronger talk radio thing. But no, I think that's true because I think we all have tendencies to kind of latch on to whether it's an ideology or a perspective or, and I think I think one of the exciting things about Francis introducing the idea of synodality is that Francis wanted a variety of opinions. He wanted, and I think he saw that as strength in our faith. That, he worked with people who he didn't always agree with. And he wanted people to kind of be open to the process. I think that he was pretty strong on, but it wasn't, you have to think of I want people who think exactly this way. So, I mean, when we talk about my hope and my prayer, my guess is because Francis could often be an off the cuff speaker. And when you have people who are just like sitting around writing every little thing that the Pope ever says and thinking that thinking that it's official church teaching, I can imagine that we might have a Pope who might be a little bit less off the cuff, but maybe still has many of the same pastoral priorities that Francis did.
So let me go back to very directly discussing politics. In this case, the effects of negative campaigning, which we're very used to in our own elections. There are reports that traditionalist groups in America compiled dossiers on the cardinals, especially those seen as quote unquote progressive. And in the consistories, the closed door meetings held before the conclave, Cardinal Mueller, Nigeria's Cardinal Francis Arinze, and as you cited earlier, Cardinal Stella, have all attacked Pope Francis. And by inference, those who would take the same path have elected. Mueller even called Pope Francis a dictator. Other papabile have been the subject of rumors, often unsubstantiated, about their tolerance of sexual abuse. And the attacks can also be incredibly petty, including the suggestion that Cardinal Tagle is too meek and can too easily break into tears. And actually, he has a very good singing voice. Once sang John Lennon's Imagine, which has a line in it about, imagine there is no heaven, imagine there is no hell. Well, that's not the version he sang. Do you think this negative campaigning will work, or will it generate a backlash?
I'll take a first run at it. I think it generates backlash. I think it works in the secular sphere where people are primed for the kind of ad hominem attacks. We've gotten so used to that. I don't think that plays well in a Catholic world that really does strive for some shared sense of future, some consensus. I'd be surprised if those kinds of attacks from either left or right, however we label these things. My prediction would be that those rebound against their sponsor.
Father Tom, are we going to agree again?
No, Richard, you're wrong. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think you're right, Richard. I think, because, we also have to look at the voting body, and it's just like, at the end of the day, these are people who have devoted themselves to a life of God. And all of us, can get carried away by our opinions or our perspectives or whatever. And, and we, at the end of the day, I think that's to your point, Richard, I think that's one of the many things that Conclave did right, is it's like, yeah, people were really wrestling with this question of, it's like, here are my priorities, and this guy has this priorities over here, and this guy has this priority over here. And I think but at the end of the day, it's kind of like, that's what part of the discernment process is supposed to lift out. It's kind of like, all right, what in the midst of that bubbling, what truth comes forth, and who's the right person. So I would agree with that. I don't think it works as well as it might, like in the New Hampshire primary or something like that.
Well, I was struck this morning looking at all the reports that when Cardinal Parolin had a high blood pressure attack yesterday and had to be attended to for a period of time, some people say 15 minutes, some people say an hour, and then he recovered, that ends his candidacy. I mean, it's like the instant generation of something that I suspect doesn't have that much weight with the Cardinals.
Or it could play to his advantage, right? Sometimes the Cardinals are looking for a kind of transitional figure. They don't 20-year papacy. These things can split either way.
Yeah,
I do want to say, Bob, let's not sort of think about Francis's papacy as somehow either perfect or a catastrophe. He got some things wrong. I think Tom put his finger on one, the kind of easy informality of his verbal style. I think it caused some real turbulence for many of the Cardinals. I think they'll be looking for somebody with a kind of different discipline verbally that way. I think the big question also is, as I understood Cardinal Stella's reported words yesterday about, non-ordained people not in holy orders leading positions of authority in the Vatican, that's a fundamental question about the role of women in the church.
Yep.
And I am of the view, and this is not a consensus Catholic view, there are legitimate views on lots of sides of this, but I think in the contemporary world and the way the economy and politics are developing, in much of the world, there is no future for the Catholic Church in which women don't have truly full voice and real authority in Catholic culture. I don't see how that goes forward. Now, what that looks like, there's questions about deaconship, there's questions about priesthood, but there's other forms of authority. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about true substantial roles for women in leadership. And some of the Cardinals, I suspect, are extraordinarily uncomfortable with that. And some of them really do believe that has to be the future. That's, again, going to drive some of the politics here, I think.
I'm going to disagree with something you said in a minute, but I'm going to give Father Tom a chance to comment on this question about women, because it seems to me that there are two lightning rods here, aside from everything else. One is some of the cardinal electors are very upset about the Pope empowering women to a greater extent in the church. I mean, actually making a woman head of one of the dicasteries, one of the principal bodies in the Vatican, and very upset about a more welcoming attitude toward LGBT people. I mean, which were in the Catechism of the Catholic Church were called intrinsically disordered. Now, the Pope never changed that, but he never said it. He never said it. He said things that were very different from it.
And I think, and I think that goes back to, if one, I think that goes back to, like, one of the blessings of being Catholic is we've got this amazing 2,000-year tradition that guides us and supports us and gives us stories that help, like, shape how we need to move forward in an authentic way as we try to walk, in the path of Christ. One of the disadvantages of being Catholic is we've got this 2,000-year history. Like, I think sometimes I'll say, and I'm painting with ridiculously broad brushes when I say this, ridiculously broad brushes. But if you talk to, like, someone who's a Baptist, and they where do they ground their faith? They ground their faith in Scripture. So, you can go to a Baptist and say, "Hey, let's put a movie screen in the middle of the worshiping space." A Baptist might say, "Yeah, sure, that sounds great." Hey, but then you say to them, the Book of Genesis might not be a documentary. They're like, "What? What are you talking about?" Where we Catholics, people can come up to us and say, Darwin had some things to say about evolution. We're like, "Oh yeah, that's okay," but sometimes I think it's amazing we turned the altar around in the 1960s, because what the question we ask when we want to know what to do is, what did we do before? And because that history of understanding same-sex sexuality is the understanding we are currently living with is a very, very new understanding. That's a very tough thing for many people to pivot towards and understand. And I think the same thing is true with female women in leadership, even though, like, of course, we've got so many great examples. I think the other day we celebrated the feast day of Catherine of Siena, who was a great leader in the church, not of official title, but provided amazing leadership in the church. So I think it's because we're so tradition both frees us to know how to move forward, but sometimes can trap us. I think that's where that's where the rubber meets the road. And I think, the question of women and LGBTQ are so tied up with tradition. I think that's why, it's a more contentious question as we go forward.
Richard, the thing I wanted to disagree with was, first of all, I agree that the Francis's papacy wasn't perfect. In fact, I can't think of one that was, and I can think of a number that were horrid. But his informal style of talking to people communicated in a way that, if I watch old newsreels, which I did the other day, of Pius XII, and the first broadcast in English that he ever did was so stilted and so formal that if a pope did that today, no one would listen. And John Paul II also spoke off the cuff. And I wonder if it's the content of what they said rather than the character of how they said it that matters here to some of these folks.
I think I totally agree. The Cardinals are looking for someone who has the capacity to engage with some charisma with social media. That's in 21st century, that's got to be a qualifying factor. But I do think you can combine that with a certain kind of discipline that stays a little closer on message, as the marketers would say. I don't think you want somebody who's a robot who just reads the cards in front of them by any stretch. But where it appears that the informal message contradicts the formal message, that causes scandal to some, to use the old Catholic language, or will be exploited by your opposition to make you look bad, to quote a current political lexicon. It's just not good leadership to do that, what some perceived as sloppily.
Yeah. Well, you and I are just going to disagree on this, because I think the most famous line from Francis that will live on for generations is, "Who am I to judge?"
Yeah.
Which he said in a press conference coming back from a trip to South America on his plane. And I don't think it contradicts. I think in his mind, it didn't contradict doctrine, but it said we have to welcome everybody in. I would be a little suspicious of the idea that it just popped into his head. Yeah. I think it's something he thought all along. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about demographics. For the first time in history, fewer than half of the voting cardinals are European. There's been a notable increase in electors from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and a notable decrease in cardinals associated with major cities like Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Florence, Venice, which always had cardinals. What are the chances, do you think, for yet another non-Italian pope, one who's from the global South or from Asia?
Yeah.
I'll let you do this one, Richard.
I think there's real possibilities of another pope from the global South. I think that will depend on the Cardinals' read. Is there one from there who can really address some of the financial and geostrategic challenges that the church faces? one that we haven't mentioned, the church in China, after Francis died with no pope in place, quote unquote, elected a new bishop under the leadership of the communist named bishops of the Chinese church. That raises a whole bunch of questions about what the Vatican has understood to be the progress it's made with China. So they're going to have to decide on whether there's someone from the global south that they might support who could really address those two things, or do they vote in favor of somebody from probably Europe, maybe North America, who they think has more capacity to deal with those two things? I don't know the Cardinals' mind about that, but I think that may be part of what drives it.
On the financial front, are we really electing a pope to be kind of the CEO of a corporation, or are we electing a pope to be a universal pastor who goes out and gets good people who can deal with church finances?
Ideally, we're selecting both, I think. But, I see this as, think of it from a Catholic point of view. We believe in Jesus as Savior and Lord, a product of the incarnation, right? Jesus as fully human and fully divine simultaneously. I think the church is simultaneously fully of this world and therefore has these institutional interests it has to take care of, and in some profound sense transcends that humanness in a kind of mystical way that we talk about as the body of Christ. I'm not scandalized by the notion that the Cardinals are thinking about the church finances as they saw.
Oh, I'm not either. I'm just saying that isn't there the possibility, and actually Cardinal Pell had this role for a while. We didn't know how disgruntled he was until after he died. But Cardinal Pell had this role for a while to try to straighten out the church finances, and he needed the Pope to back him up. And I think the Pope did do some things that have made a difference, especially with the Vatican Bank. But I myself believe the world will be very disappointed if it looks like we've elected a kind of accountant as the Pope. Father?
We would do great with a Pope who's a great pastor and great moral leader who appoints the right people to lead Vatican finances. We wouldn't do so well if the Pope isn't the first thing.
Yeah.
Right. And I think one of the things I remember, hearing was that one of the reasons Francis was elected because one of the themes for his conclave is there was a desire to address the curia, that the curia had just gotten out of control. And that, even if Francis was kind of coming in and being off the cuff, like that was almost kind of needed to kind of deal with the curia a little bit. And I think I always go back to John Allen when he wrote in his book, All the Pope's Men, that the job of Pope is so big that no one person could do it. It's so like all the expectations. So you had like Benedict, who was like the preeminent scholar, but definitely not the orator. You had Francis, who was the cuddly uncle in so many ways, and John Paul II, and they all kind of bring their different flavors. And so, I mean, what I almost just kind of think practically is, like as opposed to like 100 years ago when like most of the everybody knew everybody knew the new Pope was going to be Italian. So it was kind of like, all right, Fred from Milan, you're going to be at this time, and all the cardinals kind of knew each other. So like they kind of knew the ins and outs. I think it's going to be interesting to see because it is such a broad college of cardinals from all over the world. They're just getting to know one another this week, many of them. So it's like I think that's a very practical concern for like what kind of rises to the top.
So let me follow up on that. Senior or well-connected cardinals who may not be papal candidates themselves have played a pivotal role in building consensus around a candidate. That happened with the elections of both John Paul II and Francis. But with so many cardinals coming from the peripheries who don't necessarily know each other well at all, is it likely to be more difficult to forge alliances and ultimately consensus? Richard, I disagree with you, so you get to go first.
I think that's just an unknown. We're in new terrain here with so many cardinals spread out from all over the world, many named in the last 6 or 7 years. My prediction is it's going to take longer than a lot of the prognosticators are saying. I think they're going to want to get to know each other. They're going to want to feel out who they think they can trust, whose insights they most value. I think this is going to take more than the 2 to 3 days that a lot of people are talking about. But mine may be one of those carcasses that are spread through history after the conclave is over, who got it all wrong too.
Well, sometimes, and by the way, the people who predict things in advance actually do get it right. I mean, Montini was right. He went in as the favorite, and he came out as the Pope. Benedict Ratzinger went in as the favorite, came out as Pope Benedict. So, some of the people walked out not as carcasses, but alive and sort of proud of the fact that they figured it out. Father?
Yeah, no, I mean, one of us had to say this line at some point. It's like walk into a conclave of Pope, you walk out a cardinal, so, there's a lot of times people walk in thinking, okay, this is the way things are going to go. But I think Richard's right. I think this is going to be a longer conclave. I did a little research on this. The longest conclave was 33 months.
Wow.
And this was between 1268 and 1271. And I think it was the clash between the French and Italian. This might have been the Avignon popes. Would that be right, Richard?
No, it's before that. It was
before that. Okay.
It was in Viterbo, and you know how it got resolved? They took the roof off the hall in which the cardinals were meeting.
Yeah.
And they stopped feeding them.
Yes. That's and a lot of
they soon elected a pope.
Yeah, no, and a lot of the rules they have right now is to kind of like, all right, guys, we got to speed this up. So I think it's gonna be interesting. But I think, Bob, you bring up an interesting point where it's like this might be a place where some of the retired cardinals, the wisdom figures, so to speak, play a stronger hand because they can kind of help guide and shepherd cardinals to support certain candidates. That's a great point.
I do think a 33-month conclave in the modern world would be a complete and utter catastrophe. So I think, John Paul had reformed the process to say after a certain number of ballots, it's going to be a majority, not 2/3. And then Benedict rolled that back and said, even though you have a runoff with 2 candidates after a certain number of ballots, they still have to get to 2/3. So it's very interesting to see whether or not they're going to feel some kind of pressure to not make the church look like it's so torn apart that the decision takes 2 weeks, for example. 2 weeks now would be an eternity, I think.
Yeah.
Having participated in not a selection of a pope, of course, but like in our community, in our Paulist community, we have a general assembly in which we decide where we want the focus to be for the next 4 years for each incoming Paulist leadership administration. At a certain point, you just want to get out of there. So at a certain point, it's just kind of like, no matter how I may have walked in feeling strongly about issue XYZ, but after that, it's like, all right, guys, look, I got tickets to Disney World. I got to go. Like, yeah, here you go. And I think that's, I suspect that's where many of the Cardinals will be after day 5 or 6, if it gets to that point.
Okay, let me turn to some other questions that folks are asking. The first one I think is really easy. What is the succession process for succeeding the cardinal who is elected pope? Is a bishop or even a priest moved up? Can the replacement come from any geography or only from the area from which the new pope came? I think we all know the answer to that. One of you want to take it?
Go, Father Tom.
Okay, no, it's whoever the pope decides to make a cardinal and whoever the pope decides to name a bishop.
And it could be somebody from anywhere in the world.
Anywhere in the world.
As I said earlier, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem is Italian.
And while cardinals are typically bishops, Richard, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. You don't have to be a bishop to be a cardinal. There was a small movement to see if Mother Teresa could be named a cardinal at one point. And there were many who were against that for reasons we discussed earlier. But a cardinal is not part of ordained ministry. It just means you have a specific office to vote on the new pope.
Yeah. Here's another question. What about the conclave is relevant to the secular population who may care most about child abuse, homophobia, the restriction of women's rights? Should they be paying attention to that feeling outside the confines of the church itself? Or is the process only of interest mainly to Catholics?
Could I take a first stab at that?
Please,
Sure.
yeah.
Catholicism is the single biggest religion in the world, rivaled only really by Islam. In the United States, it's still somewhere between 18 and 20% of the population. So it matters for everybody. But I think what really matters, our experience at the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, is that even post the scandals, the Catholic Church still has the capacity to convene conversations, not just among Catholics, but among different religions, among secular thinkers. We did a big event on nuclear war and how the United States should be thinking about nuclear weapons for the future. Something on artificial intelligence. Again, not just Catholic thinkers, but smart, engaged people thinking together about the future. We need better conversations like that aren't just shouting matches, different ideologies in the room. Thoughtful people trying to build a better future for the church, but also trying to build a better future for the United States of America and for the world. And Catholic spaces are one of the few places that are convening those these days. And the Pope is a really significant leader in that process. The symbolism, the power of the papal witness, I think matters for our future.
Yeah, I would suggest that Pope Francis modeled, I mean, John Paul II had done some of this, but Pope Francis modeled reaching out to people who are not members of the church and engaging them in the process of discussing these issues. I think the cardinals are mindful of that. Some of them may not like it, but I suspect many of them think it's the path the church has to take.
I mean, my quick story about that is just, the amount of people from all different faith traditions and no faith traditions who have reached out to me personally and offered me condolences at the passing of Pope Francis, and as having so many people who are just Catholics but not going to church, or just not religious at all for whatever reason, who have just talked about how much Pope Francis meant to them. I think it was really, truly inspiring to kind of see, not only what Francis Bergoglio did with the office, so to speak, of the papacy, but what the papacy does have the ability to proclaim and witness, particularly in this time where it's the amount of fascination, I mean, it's we Americans, we're like, we like to think of ourselves as so modern, and we are, and that's a great thing about us. But it never ceases to amazes me how like everybody, no matter what their faith tradition is, stops and pays attention to this conclave. And whenever this conclave process happens, it's significant in ways I think people can verbalize, and even in ways people can't verbalize.
Okay, I'm going to try and get a number of these other questions in. Any realistic chance an American could be elected?
I think no. I don't think this conclave there's going to be an American. I think the American church has too much economic power, and the cardinals will be wary of also putting the power of the papacy in American hand. Maybe a different North American, not from the United States, but my prediction would be not an American.
I would tend to agree with that. I've got a friend, a Paulist friend, who's the rector at San Patricio in Rome, and he's like Father Matt Barrios, and when you spend time in Rome, he's plugged into everything. He's just like, the amount of disdain many people in Italy have for Americans right now is not small, That being said, if there was one that had a possibility, I saw this in NCR today, but another Paulist who spends a lot of time in Rome thought that Cardinal Prevost, who is an American-born Augustinian friar, but has spent the majority of his time in Europe and Peru, may be American by birth, but maybe not seen as American, and because he's had high-ranking positions of the Vatican, a lot of the cardinals and bishops would know him. So that would be an outside possibility. But agreeing with Richard, yeah, I think American is I think there's too much of a cultural resistance to that.
Yeah, some anonymous cardinal was quoted as saying, Prevost is the least American of the Americans.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I don't think he meant it as a compliment. We have a question here about the movie Conclave. What are your thoughts on its accuracy? And you can include or leave out the surprise twist at the end.
Yeah.
I was amazed at how they reproduced the Sistine Chapel and all those places in the Vatican where this is all going to occur, because they mostly did this at Cinecittà Studios in Rome.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, there's those who think it's toxic anti-Catholicism. I didn't see the movie that way. I thought the twist at the end was sort of a play to contemporary culture and wide audiences. I thought what it got right was that mixture of a kind of crass edge of politicking combined with a deep effort on the part of some of the cardinals in the movie to really find the right candidate for the future and discern the working of the Spirit in that process. I thought it actually portrayed that. So others disagree and thought it was really an anti-Catholic screed. I didn't read it that way.
It's certainly, in my view, certainly not anti-Catholic, but go ahead, Father.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the scene at the end of the movie where the Martians invaded the Sistine Chapel and then installed their own pope, I thought that was a real twist. I'm just kidding. That's not the surprise ending if you haven't seen it. I'm getting that mixed up with Mars Attacks. I'm sorry. No, I mean, I think it's a good. I was talking with another Paulist about this, and he said, you know what, it's kind of to your point, Richard, it showed there's a lot of politicking that goes in Rome. I mean, I remember like being frustrated with the church for a long time. And then I went to Rome, Italy, and I was like, oh my gosh, it all makes sense now. Everything I love about the church and everything I struggle about the church is all right here, and and the quote that you read from Cardinal Ratzinger in the beginning, Bob, I think, yeah, there's politicking and there's some sharp elbows and people are willing to throw a punch thinking they're doing the right thing and throwing the punch. But I think sometimes we can be so oversensitive when we talk about sensitive topics in the church. But there were a lot of good and well-meaning people, like Ray Fiennes' character was trying to do the right thing without Anthony Tucci. He was trying to do, everybody was trying to do the right thing. They were seeking forgiveness from one another. Honestly, the only part of the film I kind of struggled with is I kind of questioned whether Ray Fiennes' character broke the seal of confession in one scene. And if there was actually a problem I had with the film, that would be seen in the film.
Okay, one more question, then I'm going to close with a memory that I have. But the question I think is really interesting. Have any of you met a pope? Can you describe the experience? I'm curious if it feels profoundly moving and spiritual, or if it feels like meeting a president or a prime minister. Either of you ever met a pope? Go ahead, Father.
I met Pope Francis in 2018. As you introduced me before, I worked for Paulist Productions, and we're the film studio that produced the film Romero, starring Raul Julia. And when Oscar Romero was canonized, I had the opportunity to go to Rome and be present for the canonization. And I knew somebody from my days in Canada who worked with Pope Francis, and I wanted to give him a copy of the DVD. And he said, well, why don't you give it to him? And I was like, so he said, basically, be at this place. Pope Francis will be walking by, and I will introduce you. And I don't want to say like otherworldly, because I think one of the great saintly attributes of Francis is his goodness and also his like relatableness or his accessibility. That you do feel like you're talking with a friend or with a trusted uncle, and just a sense that he is a truly good man. And I think that was my experience of him. Everything, the coming attractions were all true. That was my impression.
Yeah, I had a friend who helped advance Pope John Paul's first trip to the United States, and he was waiting in the trailer, the holding room, as the Pope came back in from the crowd. And the first thing the Pope said was, "Would someone please get me a beer?"
Yeah. It's a very Polish thing to say.
Look, I'm going to close with a memory. I was in Italy at Villa La Piede for the NYU campus in 2013, and we had a conference about the conclave before it happened. There was a priest who was an expert Vaticanologist, an Italian journalist, one of the leading journalists in the country, and they pointed to Cardinal Scola, the then Archbishop of Milan, and others like him, and said the only possibility that could be elected was going to be someone who was very much in the mold of Benedict. And on the basis of nothing, except my memories of 1958, and I was a teenager then, I suggested that there might just be another Pope John hiding in the corner. Well, that turned out to be true. And we have lived for 12 years with a Pope of surprises. Soon we will know what other surprises may lie in store. Let me thank both of you and for this terrific discussion. I hope all of you who are watching enjoyed it, whether you joined us on Zoom or Facebook Live. Watch for more of our podcasts. Let's find common ground during the summer, and please join us for our programming in the fall. In the meantime, in the days ahead, we will wait to witness the parting of the drapes, or maybe if Richard's right, in the weeks ahead, the parting of the drapes on the balcony of St. Peter's and the emergence of the cardinal who will proclaim Habemus Papam. Good day. And what, Richard?
And may we all be praying not for particular candidates, but that the cardinals will be guided by the spirit of unity and truth and beauty and justice that undergirds the church.
So that we don't get someone who fits the mold of the popes that were being described by Benedict when he said, obviously, these folks were not picked by the Holy Spirit. Anyway, thank you all. And for those who find the political drama and the religious significance of this gripping, have a great conclave. Take care.